Welcome back, folks. Today we are going to be finishing off our underarm gussets, and if you're using gores that start at the waist, we're going to be sewing down the side seams to that point. If you remember back to when we were cutting out, we made that shoulder to waist mark just on the edge of our fabric. That's going to come in really handy now. We will sew the final gusset side just as we have the others, with a run and fell seam, and then when we get to sewing down to the waist, we're going to use a split fell, and there's two reasons for that. Firstly, splitting this side seam makes it an awful lot easier when you get to the point of inserting your side gores to get all those little edges that are going to need tucking away of all the seam allowances in nice and neat and flat. Secondly, this is an area, especially on kids' clothes, that likes to pop. I don't know why, but it just seems to be the area I end up repairing most often on both my own kit and my children's. So, using this split fell seam with a backstitch, not only does it make it a nice strong seam, but it makes it really easy to repair because you don't need to undo any of the felling to get that seam strong again. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to that point. So, ready? Off we go. So to begin, we're going to look at the technique for joining these side pieces down to our waist point. The method that we're going to use when we're taking our gores almost up under that gusset is very similar. However, it's a very small area that we'll be working in. So we're going to start off with this longer one, just so you can get a good idea of what the technique is and how it works. You can use this technique on wool or linen, it's going to work for both. The only difference here really is where you're going to be starting your gores. So as you can see, here we've got the marks that we put in to mark our shoulder to waist point. There's a bit where I went wrong. Ignore that bit. This is the correct measurement. I've already gone back and checked it. So the first thing that we need to do is get all of this pinned together, ready to join. Now at this stage, it's very important that we get the tensions right all the way along here and that we match up our points as closely as possible. Now we know, because we measured down from the shoulder to the waist on both sides, that those 2 points meet exactly. And if we align those, then our hem will be nice and even at the bottom. We then come up to just under the gusset here and pin that one. Hopefully that seam should now lay lovely and flat. Then we come up to this last side of our gusset. I'm going to fold it over, just have a look at how everything's laying, making sure that we're happy with all of these joins and the tension on them. If we pin like that, that's going to sit really nicely. So I'll pop my first clip or pin in there. Another one just here, very close to that join. You can have a feel at this point and just make sure everything's meeting nicely. If it's not, you can move to either side ever so slightly. You've got a little bit of play here in this section just to make sure it's all laying nicely. But if you've been careful with the rest of them, this piece should come together very easily at this point. Pinch that there, pop another clip just there. And then we're going to pop clips down here as well. Keeping careful notice of that final clip there. You may decide you want to pop another one on, just so as you get to this point and you're ready to stop, the fabric isn't going to pull at all. And that is all ready to be sewn up. To join these two sides together, we're going to be using a backstitch all the way along here, right down to the bottom. These two are going to be slightly different when we come to do the seam treatments right at the end, but for these initial joining stitches, the back stitch is what you want because it's an incredibly strong stitch. And this point here is an exceedingly weak point on the garment and where it will be prone to more stress than any other area of the garment. So once again, to begin, we're going to start by securing our thread on the wrong side. So this part here, when it's all finished, is going to be folded over this way, so we can safely leave our thread tail in just here. Here is the leftover thread from where we joined that side. We're going to come in lovely and close right there at that point to fix our thread. Take my needle in just to the side there, come up and check I'm happy. Then I'm going to pop in a little knot to secure that thread. Where I've got two ends of thread together, I often just pop a little knot in those as well, join them together just to give it a little bit more strength. It's quite hard when I've cut it so short, but we will see what we can do. There we go, so that's nicely fixed in there. We flip over, we're absolutely where we want to be, and then we're going to backstitch all the way down here. I'll do a little bit, then I'll come back and see you just to show you again getting that join nice and neat, and then we'll go all the way down. Now when we reach this join, I'm just going to check inside and see where that last stitch that joins these two pieces together comes to. That's just there. We need to make sure we're getting right in close before we secure our thread and then start on this long length. So we're going to go very carefully here with our last couple of stitches, just to make sure we're meeting up very nicely with that corner. Yep, that last one was dead on, so we're just going to secure this in now and then we will start on the long length. So pop a little knot just there. Then I'm going to take my needle straight down through my fabric, pop out on this side. So checking in there, we want to come just inside those two stitches because this single tight stitch is going to be neater than both of these sides coming together. So we're going to go slightly back on ourselves and in and through, making sure we're not catching any of this. Make a nice knotted stitch there. Pull it nice and tight. Then we're ready to proceed with the back stitch all the way down to there. Okay, so we've got that sewn up all the way to the end there. The next thing we need to do is the seam treatments on this section. Now we're going to do this bit first, so that once that's all where we want it, this can simply fold over the top and be tucked down to finish all the felling for that upper part of the garment. So we're going to begin with this straight piece here that's joining the two main body pieces. We're going to do a split fell here. There are 3 reasons why a split fell seam works really well here. Firstly, it's going to lay flatter, so when you're wearing the garment, it's less likely to rub at the sides around your waist. Secondly, when we come down here to do all of this felling, when we're putting our gores in, having this split is going to make it a lot easier to get these bits neat at the top. And lastly, this area here, especially coming up to the underarm gore there, is subject to an awful lot of force in wear and movement. And this bit tends to be the part where my kids' clothes split. So I developed this to make it really easy to repair, because when you flat fell to either side, if this initial stitching does come undone, it shouldn't because it's backstitched now, but if it does, what you can do is fold it all together, do a bound seam along here, and you're finished. And this part does not need to be undone and felled as it would do if you folded it all to one side, which is what we've mostly done so far, and this had split. In order to repair this initial one, you'd have had to undo some of the felling, and it takes a lot longer to repair than if your felling is intact and all you're doing is running a bound seam along there. So that's really worth remembering. What we're going to do now is grab a few pins, just tack this down into place so that it's where we want it when we come to sew. Okay, so we've got that pinned into place and ready to sew down. It's a little bit uneven in places because it's quite hard to pin through this wool, but we'll just tuck it in as we go, and we're going to whip stitch all the way up there and all the way down there. But before we do that, I'm just going to take a moment now to trim out this excess seam allowance. So once we've finished all this, we're going to come back and do this part here. We're going to trim the seam allowance now so that we can get everything neat and tidy up under this end. So I'm going to flip it all over, grab my scissors, and then from that little mark that we made there, I'm going to make a very gradual snip down into this corner. Just take this out all the way along to meet up there. That's where we snipped to when we were doing this bit up here. It takes some of the bulk out of here and will make it all much easier to tuck in. Now we've got quite a lot of bulk here. I've still got my clips on that are holding all this long body piece together. However, we have got an awful lot to manipulate here. So this bit can be a little bit tricky, but just take your time, move your work about until you get it at an angle that works well for you. Now the first thing that we need to do is secure our thread in. I've only pinned up to here. We're going to leave some of this loose because we can tuck it all together. When we come to put our gores in at the end here, we're going to need some of this to be loose so we can get it all exactly where we want it. So I'm going to start about an inch or so, maybe a little bit more, above where I expect the finished folded gore piece to come to. It'll take up about that much room, so we'll start just here. Please forgive me having to have half my cans covered by fabric, but at this point it does get rather fiddly. I'll take my needle up, keeping the thread tail inside of the work so we're not going to see that, and start whip stitching all the way up this line. My first stitch, I'll make a knot through, just hold on to the bottom, give it a tug, and it's secure. I shall whip stitch up here. I'll see you in just a moment and we'll talk about getting this top nice and sorted out before we need to fold this bit down over it. Okay, so as you can see, we've whip stitched that whole side of the seam down. When we get up to here, as you can see, it's just getting a little bit thinner. There's just a couple of threads that we need to tuck in because when this comes down and over, going to come to about there. So we want to make sure that these threads are tidied up nicely, and that when we move over, we tuck everything down and do the same on the other side. So I'm going to come in here. Please excuse the slightly strange angle. It's kind of hard to do it on camera, but we're going to try. Tucking in those last few threads to keep that nice and tidy. As you can see, I've popped up right near the middle of the seam. When we go back in, we're going to go back in close again, and we're going to tuck all this away as well. So we come in, we finger press it down, tuck it in as closely as possible, and then start just taking all of these bits in. Now, I'm a little bit concerned that that's too fat, so I'm going to trim a little bit off, get rid of some of these loose threads, just to make sure we get a nice even turn there. Pop a pin back in there. Turn it all as closely as you can, keep it pinned down with your nail, and then tidy all of these in, making sure you're not catching any of this gusset piece at the top. We want to be just catching these little edges here. Don't pull too hard, just get your stitches nice and neat through that little turned edge there. Work your way all the way out to the main seam, and then we're just going to do exactly the same again. We're going to be whip stitching all the way down here. When we get to this side, that's where we started, that's where we'll stop. We'll leave these bits loose, as we've done with a lot of the others, so that we can tuck it all in with the next bit when we get there. Once that's all done, I'm going to be moving on to finishing off this gusset. So I shall see you in a moment. Once you've finished split felling all of those seams, we're going to come back and we're going to finish off this last bit of the gusset. We need to tuck it all the way round and pin it first, and then we're just going to use our whip stitch all the way along again, right until we get to the end here. It's worth noting here that while I am choosing to roll these underneath, it's not strictly necessary with this wool. If you wanted to do raw edges tacked down, instead of using this split fell and tuck technique, instead of turning all of this under, I could choose to just simply fell it down flat there, just using a wider whip stitch to hold it all down. And again, I could use a little bit of cord over the edge if I wanted to. You can see on this example here where I've done just that. With this really nice heavy wool, it's not going to fray at all. And you can see all those little whip stitches just holding down the raw edge by itself. And that's lasted beautifully for a few years already. So let's get this pinned into place, make sure everything's laying nicely, and get sewing. Once that's all been whip stitched down, here we have a finished gusset and a finished side seam, almost down to the waist. There's nothing loose there that's going to catch or irritate or pull or lead to a problem. Everything's lovely, nicely, neatly tucked away. If I flip it over briefly, I'll show you what this is going to look like on the right side. And there we have it, a beautifully sewn in underarm gusset and a really lovely strong side seam all the way down here. And you can see, folding all of those edges out away from that main underarm gusset, you'll be able to feel that that means that's really nice and slim and it's not going to be too bulky underneath your arms. If you were folding everything on into itself, into these corners, you'd end up with some quite uncomfortable lumpy bits all concentrated in that one spot. So folding them outwards spreads the width and depth of the fabric out perfectly in all directions. I'm going to go and get on with the other one of these. While I get on with finishing this, other me is going to show you what's different when you're making gores, that instead of starting at the waist, start up here just under the gusset. See you in a while. So here we are with our linen example. Now on this dress, we're going to be seating our gores up close underneath this gusset. There's two approaches to this. The first one is what we're going to go through together today. The second one is ever so slightly different. It doesn't require you to do very much at this stage. And that involves taking your gores almost right up to this point and then tidying it all down together. The reason I do things a little bit differently is it does end up with a bit of a bulky seam just there that can rub. And I found that this way makes things a little bit more comfortable. So what we're going to do this time, instead of pinning it all together and sewing all the way down to the waist, is that we're going to pin it together and sew it just around an inch, inch and a half. You could decide what works best for you, down in this section, so that when we come to seat our gores, the seam allowances for those will end up coming to about here, and this point here will be folded down onto there. They'll almost meet. As I said in the first section, it's very, very similar, but there's a lot less sewing involved here, which can make it a bit fiddly, and we'll leave these sections here unfelled to make it easier to get everything tucked in when we get on to putting our gores in. So whichever method you're going to use for this, the first thing you need to do is pin all this, clip all this together and make sure that you're happy that everything's sitting properly. Now, because we don't have a waist mark here, we're going to be using this mark here and very, very carefully matching all this up, making sure that everything is laying nice and flat before we start, so that we're absolutely certain that we're attaching these properly. If you get these off, what you can get is a little bit of pulling around here, and we want to try and avoid that. Here we've got all of our lengths still pinned together. What you can choose to do at this stage is unpin all of this, give it all a press and pin together the sides all the way up to this point to make sure you're absolutely happy that everything is laying right. However, that shouldn't be necessary. You can always even up at the end if there's a little bit of discrepancy between the front and back main body pieces. It's not usually too much of a problem, but I just thought I'd mention it now. If you'd like to, you can unpin all of that, iron it and use the whole of this side pinned together to make sure everything's laying right. For now, we're going to simply work with this little mark that we made just here. Now, remember when we were cutting our pieces, we marked on our fabric where the first side of our gusset would be, where our sleeve finished, and the last part of our gusset as well. You can see there, that's in line. What we're going to do is take any tension off of this bit, fold back this section here, make sure it's not pulling that at an angle, just gently lay it back, and then we're going to bring the mark this side together. Don't let go of it. Ease along here, make sure these are absolutely perfectly in place. pop a clip on. Do the same again. And you come up here, you make sure you're happy with where that's placed. And then what we're going to do, slide that clip right up there. In fact, that's not a very good one to use because it's a little bit looser, so I'm going to pop a really strong one on there. There we go. Now when we unfold all of this and flip over, we can hold these, do the same again here, just make sure nothing is pulling on that first little bit there, no tension, and that's lining up absolutely perfectly. So we're going to pop some clips on there, and then just before we sew, we're going to make ourselves a little guide mark to work to. So once all of your clips are in place and you're happy with those, we're just going to make a little mark so that we can choose how far down we're going to sew this bit. Now if we look this side, there's our mark, just there. I would suggest leaving an inch, maybe an inch and a half if you're a bit nervous about this. Once this corner seam here, like that, this will be folded in a similar point, so you need to leave a small amount of room for that. Then you need to leave room for where all of the seam allowances of your gores are going to fold up onto. Here's one I made earlier to show you what I mean. You need to have that little bit of room so that everything can fold in nice and neatly. So there's my under-gusset mark. I'm going to measure an inch along, just make a very light mark just to show myself where to sew up to. And with that, we're ready to start sewing. So just as on the woolen example, I've joined my thread there underneath in the part that's going to be felled down so you don't see it. And we're going to do exactly the same as we did before and whip stitch all the way down here. Take our needle carefully through and then down to this mark that we made here to give ourselves room for turning those seam allowances. I'm going to get this bit sewed down and then I'm going to stop and talk to you quickly about what you need to do here if you decide that you're going to use that other method where your gores come absolutely up to the gusset all the way. So as I come up to do this last back stitch, hitting that corner nice and evenly, just made sure that none of this was getting caught underneath, because what we don't want is to accidentally be stitching into this. We're going to do one final stitch here and secure it nice and strong. Instead of going further on, we're just going to come out that same hole that we've just gone into. And I'll pop a little knot in the thread there. And then, if you're going to use the alternate method, I will show you that in the next video on an example piece, then you can stop here. You don't need to do anything else to this part, because we'll come back and finish that once the gores are seated. If you try and do that now, you'll be felling down onto an open seam and that won't work. So, if you decide you want to do this alternate method, stop here. Nothing else you need to do for now. However, if you're going to follow me along now and just put this little extra inch of side seam in, what we need to do is take our needle through to the other side, move all of this excess back out the way and make sure we're getting a nice neat corner between our main body pieces. So go down and through out to this side. And then what we're going to do is undo those 2 clips. Have a look inside, that's all lining up beautifully. Push everything back out of the way so that all we're sewing through here are these body pieces. I tend to just pop a clip back on temporarily to make sure that everything's exactly how I'd like it to be. So our first stitch, we're going to come through, turn everything over, make sure that we're lining up there, pop our stitch straight through, oops, don't drop it, pop our stitch straight through and come back just there. Gentle tug and then carry on with your back stitching down to the point that you've marked. Once again, we're going to make sure that this final stitch is really secure. Just pop a little knot in there. Lovely. That is now ready to proceed to the next stage. Okay, so we've got those joined together nicely. We've sewn down that inch. What we need to do now is cut away some of the excess seam allowance that's under here and then pin it all down ready to fell. So if we have a look under here, that's almost all cut away already. So we're just going to take that one, snip it off there. We may need to cut a little bit more when we get there. We'll have a look in a second. And then we're going to do the same thing, trim out all this excess seam allowance under here that's putting bulk into these seams. Make sure you're not catching any of this part because that's all going to be turned under to protect the seam. Now, when we were looking at the wool garment that had the side seam all the way down to the waist, before we did anything with this, we sewed all this down. We're not going to do that on this type of garment. Instead, we're going to pin this into place where we want it to sit for now. Tuck it all in and under and pop a pin in. We're going to make sure that that pin comes a little way down because all of this will be tucked and finished with the ends of the gores. For now, we're just going to pin it in place so that it doesn't move around while we get this first part felled down. We're going to do the same again for the other side. Turn it up right underneath there, press it with your fingers, and then just pop a temporary pin in there so that it's not going anywhere. Now it's time to get all this folded round nice and neat, tucked in, ready to fell. So first thing I do is I lay it down and I spread out the fabric each side to make sure that this is laying as flat as it can. You don't want any of these rucks being sewn in with this. So we're going to turn this part under. Pop that pin up out of the way. This bit is very fiddly. However, you won't regret taking the time to do this now. So that needs tucking under further. Just a little bit up there to make sure all those raw edges are tucked in. Fold that under. Make sure everything is in line. Tuck that under a little further as well. And then we're going to pop our first pin in just there. Make sure that first pin doesn't come over to the point. You need to keep it to that side of the seam allowance, otherwise it'll interfere with you turning this bit under. So So once again, I'm going to get hold of that. We're going to turn that under to make a point. These pins will try and get in the way, so just readjust them whenever you need to. And fold. And the point of that fold should line up with the middle of that seam there. I'm going to hold on to that while I check all of this is right. Tuck that under, and then I'm just going to pop a pin right in the end there to hold that in place while we pop the rest of the seam in. We come up, checking that this split fell under here. It's well tucked in at the top, so that we're going to secure that down with the gusset seam allowances. At this point, I pop a hand inside the sleeve so that I can get the tension nice and even all around that join there. Another pin in there. And then, before I do this middle section, come up to this end. This is where we've got a turn to navigate. So we're going to tuck first, that little bit under there. Then we're going to fold the whole lot over, tuck it all in together, nice and tidy. Pinch it with your thumb and forefinger inside, and then pop a pin in to hold that where you want it. And then finally, I'm just going to go all the way along here, tucking in that excess. If there's any bunching happening, just stretch it over your hand, ease it in, and everything will end up in the right place. And there we are, ready to fill that down. Now this is thread that I was using to sew along here. I'm going to snip that off, and then I'm going to switch to my matching thread to do the whip stitching. So holding on to the seams with my forefinger inside the seam and my thumb out over the top, just so that I can keep all of this in place as I'm going along. I'm going to start my whip stitching. I'm going to pop that pin out, very carefully start going along. When I get to this corner, I'm going to take particular care to make sure that I'm anchoring everything really nicely, exactly where I want it. When we get to this point, I take that pin out. Make sure you catch both this turned edge here and this part of the gusset seam allowance together. That little bit of the folds wanting to pop out. So what I'm going to do is really carefully go around here, securing it down all together so it's not going to go anywhere. Then, as we pop in the final couple of whip stitches, securing those with a knot and hiding in our thread tails into the seams themselves, we have almost finished the entirety of the top half of our tunic or dress. Absolutely fabulous. And there we have our finished underarm gusset and that little section there that we're going to be folding back the seam allowances of our gores onto. It's okay to take the pins out of here for now. We can pop those all back in when we get to this bit. What I will say for now, this is the same whichever method you're using, whether it's the woolen down to the waist one we looked at before, or this one. Before you leave your work, pop a little clip in here just to protect the end of that little seam. Just pop it in there, right next to where the seam is. And that means that if this gets pulled about at all as you're doing the next preparatory items for the next stage, it's going to minimise any stress on that join and stop it gaping. So what I'm going to do now is give all of these seams that have been finished a really good press. I'm going to do the same to the entire garment. I'm going to take all of these clips out that I've had up protecting these long edges for all this time, and we're going to iron all of that out so that we've got a really lovely canvas to work on to start putting in our gores in the next video. And here we are with both garments all sewn up right to the point where their gores are going to start. First of all, we've got our woolen garment. You can see there sewn right down to the waist. This is what it looks like on the right side when it's all finished. Everything tucked in, neat and tidy. And then here we have our garment with gores that are going to start up under the gusset just here. We haven't sewn these in at the sides yet, but we've got that gusset all secure all the way around. If we take a look at the inside of the garments, you can see here all four sides of that gusset are now locked down tight, and those folds are going to make the underarm incredibly strong and resistant to any damage, which is an occupational hazard when you're swinging a sword around. Down at the bottom there, you can see that split or flat felled seam just running down an inch or so, ready to be finished once the gores are sewn in. And here, on our woolen example, the same again, everything tucked in, nice and neat and tidy, with that split or flat felled seam running all the way down to the waist there. That's where the gores will be seated on a garment that has gores starting from the waist. And remember, if your wool is well fulled and not likely to fray, you can choose to omit the turn here and just fell down your raw edges if you prefer. Just trim them nicely and you'll end up with something that looks a little bit like this. Now we've got our sides all sewn up, and the next stage is going to need these lengths to be pressed and ready for sewing. So that's what I've done here. I've unclipped all of these pieces and I've given everything a nice press to get it all laying lovely and smooth, ready for inserting our gores. It's worth getting that done now so that as soon as you get out those gores ready to sew, there'll be nothing holding you back from getting the sides of this garment sewn in. Phew, it's all done. Now I know that was a fiddly section. There's an awful lot of folding things and twiddling them about to get them in the right place, but it's well worth taking the time to do properly. If you've got any questions, anything that's unclear, pop a message down in the comments and I'll do my very best to help. Now in the next one, it's going to be a bit of a longer video because there's lots to cover. We're going to be talking about inserting side gores into your garment. There's lots to cover there. So get those side seams sewn up, get that gusset bit last line, get it all felled and neat so you're absolutely ready to move on to this penultimate stage. We really are getting close to having a finished garment now, folks. Thank you for hanging on in there with me. Have a wonderful day and I will see you soon. Bye.